Sometimes, a single moment can unravel our carefully constructed lives and alter them forever. Such a moment arrives for Darryl Whittaker, a reserved auto mechanic in a small, tight-knit town, when he chances upon a horrifying car accident one night. An officer lies unconscious inside a vehicle, engulfed in flames, and Darryl makes a snap decision to save him. In that instant, he unwittingly ignites a fuse that will force him to confront old traumas, repair broken bridges, and question everything he believes about duty and belonging. What follows is a remarkable journey of bravery, self-discovery, and community transformation, one you won't want to miss. Darryl Whittaker rarely found himself in the spotlight. A talented mechanic at 35, he preferred the familiar routines of fixing cars, heading home to a modest dinner, and savoring life's quieter gifts. The hush of well-worn asphalt beneath his tires, the clang of metal tools in his garage, these were the sounds that soothed him. But the calm he cultivated was a fragile sanctuary. Beneath the gentle rhythm of small-town life, tension simmered, especially around the subject of race and policing. Darryl, a black man, was no stranger to subtle hostilities. He dealt with them politely, determined never to let rancor define his days. Yet Darryl once burned brighter in life, wearing the uniform of a firefighter. In that role, he earned a reputation for quick thinking amid infernos and disasters. He rushed into collapsing buildings without hesitation, saved terrified children, and carried a strong moral code in his heart. But a single tragedy had broken that part of him. A raging apartment fire, one that was supposed to be a routine call, cost him much more than just a few scars. On that fateful day, heavy smoke and flames cut off escape routes, leaving Darryl and a 5-year-old boy cornered by the heat. In the chaos, a collapsing beam pinned Darryl's leg, nearly trapping him. Though he freed himself and saved the child, his mind refused to release him from that fear. Terrible nightmares followed, and his confidence as a first responder eroded. No matter how hard he tried, he could not banish the memory of suffocating smoke, the searing flames, and the terror of failing someone who relied on him. In time, Darryl resigned from the fire department. Fixing cars became his new focus, an occupation he'd picked up from his father. Machines, after all, did not cry or scream. They merely asked for a steady hand and patience. In the small town where Darryl lived, local politics and old grudges knitted a complex social fabric. The police force, in particular, was sometimes at odds with the black community. The tension quietly permeated coffee shops, convenience stores, and even the sidewalks. Despite his private nature, Darryl was aware of every sideways glance and every whisper. Still, he kept his head low. Most days, he was content to be invisible. That seemed far safer than inviting trouble. Among the officers, one name consistently surfaced: Bradley Sullivan. This white policeman, tall and broad-shouldered, carried a stern, no-nonsense expression that seemed sculpted into his face. Some townsfolk praised him for running a tight ship. Others complained that his policing placed more suspicion on black families than any others. Stories drifted through the community tales of Bradley's excessive scrutiny during traffic stops, of citizens who left encounters feeling humiliated or misunderstood. Darryl had never personally crossed paths with Officer Bradley, but he recognized the type: lawman who believed wholeheartedly in order but neglected the consequences of enforcing it too harshly. One late evening, life hurled Darryl back into the kind of danger he thought he'd left behind. He had just closed up the garage and was driving home along a winding country road. The sun had set, leaving the pavement illuminated only by headlights. A sense of contentment washed over him as he thought of dinner and a decent night's sleep. Then, in the near distance, he caught sight of a pair of headlights swerving violently. A shriek of tires tore through the silence, and his own heart lurched when a car shot off the road, crashed through a flimsy guardrail, and skidded down the embankment. Before Darrell could process it, an explosion shook the still air, sending up a wave of heat. Fear crushed his chest. The flickering orange glow threw him back to his worst memories. But he also felt a familiar compulsion stir something left over from his days in uniform. Someone in that car was fighting for their life. Without hesitation, Darrell slammed on his brakes, jumped out, and sprinted toward the blaze. The overturned vehicle was already on fire, smoke streaming from beneath the hood. Flames wreathed the front tires, dancing in the darkness. Drawing on instincts he had once desperately tried to bury, Darrell rushed forward, ignoring the searing heat clawing at his arms. A figure, unconscious or close to it, was pinned to the driver's seat. Quick bursts of light revealed the uniform of a police officer. Darrell's former training roared to life. He wrapped his jacket around his hands to protect them from the flames, wrestling the twisted door until metal screamed and finally gave way. In the swirl of choking smoke, he unlatched the officer's seatbelt, then hauled the man out, inch by perilous inch. Darrell was operating on pure adrenaline. Smoke stung his lungs, fear hammered in his ears, and sweat soaked through his shirt. He dragged the motionless body up the slope, clearing only a few yards before the vehicle exploded behind them, causing him to dive onto the grass. Coughing and spluttering, Darrell turned to the officer, searching for signs of life. He pressed trembling fingers to the man's neck, a weak pulse, but still there. Relief washed over him, though his mind reeled with the reality of saving an officer's life. By the harsh glow of the wreck, he recognized the bloodied face, Bradley Sullivan. Fate had chosen to put him in Darrell's hands. Sirens soon pierced the air, the next minutes blurred in Darrell's memory. He heard raised voices, the arrival of paramedics, the swirl of red and blue lights dancing over burnt grass and shattered metal. His instincts told him to remain invisible. As soon as paramedics took over, Darrell quietly withdrew. He limped to his truck, unnoticed in the frenzy, and drove home in stunned silence. That night, sleep offered little solace. Flashbacks of fire from both his firefighting days and the night's events throttled his dreams. By morning, his phone was crammed with text messages from unknown numbers and calls he'd missed. News in a small town travels at lightning speed. Even if people didn't know Darrell's name yet, they knew someone had pulled Officer Bradley from certain death. Standing in his modest kitchen, coffee in hand, Darrell felt a gnawing dread. He'd never wanted this sort of spotlight, especially not for rescuing a policeman who was infamous in parts of the black community. As the morning wore on, reporters called, curious neighbors knocked on his door, and the internet began buzzing. By late afternoon, he could barely focus on the cars he was supposed to fix at the garage. Word had gotten around that the mystery rescuer was one of their own, a local black mechanic named Darrell Whitaker. All illusions of anonymity vanished. Days passed, each more surreal than the last. Tension was palpable. While many praised Darrell for his bravery, others, especially longtime critics of the local police, felt uneasy. The storyline of Black Man Saves White Cop was irresistible to the media, who often twisted it into cliched narratives about bridging divides. Meanwhile, racist whispers resurfaced, painting Darrell as a pawn in a system that never truly cared for him. Even some extended family members worried about the attention making him a target. On the third day, while he was bent over the engine of an old sedan, Darrell got a call from a number with an Atlanta area code. The voice on the other end introduced herself as Vivian Cross, a civil rights lawyer who specialized in bridging the gap between communities of color and law enforcement. She told him she had heard his story and felt it could become a catalyst for meaningful dialogue. Before the conversation ended, she floated an invitation for Daryl to speak publicly about the incident, to explain not only his split-second decision to save Bradley, but also highlight the broader racial tensions lurking in their community. It rattled him. He hung up and felt as though he'd stepped onto a ledge. He was nobody special. He told himself just a mechanic with a past that still haunted him. That night, he wrestled with the possibility of actually standing in front of people, fielding questions about the night's rescue and the complexities of living as a black man in a racially tense town. The thought terrified him more than any blazing building ever had. Meanwhile, social media flared with speculation over Bradley's condition. Word was he'd survive his injuries but faced a tough recovery. Daryl received second-hand updates. Though he had not once visited the officer in the hospital, he wanted no further entanglement. But fate had other plans. Exactly a week after the rescue, a squad car parked outside the garage and out stepped Bradley Sullivan. He moved gingerly, his torso taped and one arm in a sling from the accident. The hush in the workshop was so complete, you could hear a socket wrench drop. Daryl stood stiffly near a half-repaired engine, uncertain how to greet a man whose life he had saved, yet whose presence had often been viewed as menacing to people like him. Bradley spoke first. "I came to thank you," he said, voice subdued. "I'm not sure I deserve what you did." Daryl inhaled sharply, noticing how the officer refused to meet his eyes. Though he'd pictured this moment 1,000 times in the days prior, words stuck in his throat. "You're alive. That's what matters," he managed quietly. For a moment, they stared at each other. Daryl saw vulnerability etched across Bradley's features. The imposing officer looked less formidable now. More human pain was making him tremble, or maybe it was just uncertainty. Eventually, Bradley mustered, "They told me you dragged me out of the car before it blew, that you practically shielded me from the blast." Daryl shrugged, unable to articulate that old habits die hard, that his firefighter instincts simply kicked in. He didn't mention the nightmares or the years he'd spent trying not to be a hero again. Bradley cleared his throat. I appreciate it," he managed. "Truly. If you need anything, just let me know." With that, the officer turned and left, leaving Daryl with a swirl of unresolved feelings. He realized, with a sinking clarity, that the story would not end there. Calls from local community leaders trickled in, praising Daryl as an example of bridging prejudice. Even the mayor's office reached out, hoping to set up a special commendation ceremony. It was all too much. Daryl merely wanted to fade back into the background. But the lawyer, Vivian Cross, persisted with gentle but unrelenting phone calls. She insisted the story had the power to galvanize real change if he dared to speak up. One evening, seeking solace, Daryl visited his older sister, Aria. Over plates of fried chicken and cornbread, he unburdened his fears. "I'm no activist," he said, frustration tugging at his voice. "I'm just a guy who saw someone in trouble." Aria listened, quiet and thoughtful. Then, looking him in the eye, she said, "Heroic acts are never just heroic acts, Daryl. They reflect who we are as a community. That moment made you realize you're stronger than your fear. Maybe it's time for this town to see that strength too." Her words weighed on him. He had once run into burning buildings to save total strangers, only to be broken by one tragic call. Now, another rescue had come, ushering him toward a different mission, one that demanded he confront the town's simmering tensions rather than sprint away from them. After days of soul-searching, Daryl finally agreed to speak at a small community gathering organized by Vivian. It was held at a local church hall, an understated venue with folding chairs and minimal fanfare. Yet the turnout was surprisingly large, both long-time residents and new faces, some hopeful, some skeptical. In the front rows, Aria and a few supportive friends watched anxiously. Daryl's hands shook as he gripped the microphone, beads of sweat forming on his brow. He started hesitantly, recounting the moments leading up to the fiery accident, describing the rush of terror and the fleeting thought that he could either run or help, even if it cost him his life. Then he paused, scanning faces in the crowd. Some nodded in empathy, others waited, arms folded, deciding whether he deserved their trust. Taking a steadying breath, he pressed on. "I didn't rescue Officer Sullivan because of his badge," he said. "I did it because I was raised to value human life, and once upon a time I believed it was my duty to save whoever I could." That belief was shattered for a while, but in that moment, it all came back. He dared to add, "This isn't just my story, though. It's our story. We live every day in a town where you can feel the tension on the sidewalks. We don't talk about it, but it's there. We know it. We ignore it. Maybe this event is a chance to do more than just coexist." The hush in the room felt electric. Then came a wave of applause, hesitant at first, and soon resounding. Daryl exhaled, tears pinching at the corners of his eyes. In the days that followed, it was clear his words had struck a nerve. More invitations to speak rolled in from high schools, civic organizations, and, to his astonishment, an upcoming city council meeting. However, not everyone approved. Early one morning, Daryl arrived at the garage to find hateful graffiti scrawled across the metal shutters, racial slurs, vicious remarks about betraying his own community by supporting the police. It stung terribly, but he refused to be bowed by fear. Many in town, including neighbors he barely knew, turned up to help clean the walls and repaint them. Among them was Bradley, wearing his uniform. The two men exchanged a silent nod before scrubbing the ugly words from existence. As Daryl navigated the complexities of sudden local fame, he found an unlikely ally in Bradley. Initially, their interactions were stiff, overshadowed by an unspoken history of mistrust. Yet time and circumstance brought them closer. Bradley confessed he'd been rethinking his approach to policing since the accident, acknowledging blind spots he'd never confronted. "I used to think law and order were all that mattered," he told Daryl, "but I'm realizing you can't police a town you don't really know or understand." Daryl sensed sincerity in the officer's voice. The seeds of a cautious friendship took root. Together, they proposed monthly Q&A sessions with residents and the police, an idea that divided the department, yet slowly gained traction. Some colleagues of Bradley's resisted change, while others recognized an opportunity to connect with the community in ways they never had before. Meanwhile, Vivian encouraged Daryl to look beyond local efforts. "Your story has power," she kept repeating. It wasn't just the drama of saving a police officer, it was Daryl's transformation from withdrawn mechanic to a voice calling for empathy and accountability. She helped arrange interviews for larger newspapers and eventually a short televised segment on a statewide channel. Through it all, Daryl struggled with the weight of a platform he had never asked for. Memories of the fire, the nightmares that once plagued him, sometimes returned. Public attention made him question if he was strong enough to keep going. Support from Aria, Bradley, Vivian, and new allies reminded him that he didn't have to do this alone. Each speaking event taught him something new about bridging divides. He listened to the stories of families who had lost loved ones to excessive policing, of officers who had never heard a grateful word from the people they protected, of activists who were frustrated and exhausted by decades of minimal progress. Over time, Daryl learned the delicate art of forging common ground. One day, as he was finishing an afternoon shift at the garage, his phone rang with a startling proposition. A major civil rights conference invited him to speak on a panel about community healing and law enforcement. Prominent figures from across the region would attend: police chiefs, activists, local politicians. Terrified though he was, he accepted. A few weeks later, Daryl found himself in a bustling convention center, stepping onto a platform he never thought he'd see in his lifetime. The stage lights made him sweat, and a nervous churn twisted his stomach. But once he began sharing his story, hearing the hush fall over hundreds of attendees, he found a new clarity. He spoke of fear and bravery, of how one moment of selflessness can open doors to meaningful change, and of how towns like his needed fundamental healing from years of mistrust. An hour later, the applause was thunderous. To his surprise, police chiefs came up to thank him, as did activists who saw him as proof that even those hesitant to speak could become catalysts. Reporters pulled him aside with more questions, and invitations were extended for further dialogues. That evening, feeling drained but invigorated, Daryl strolled through nearby city streets and realized that for the first time in years, he was no longer running from his past trauma. He was forging a new path born of it. Back in his hometown, tangible transformations were afoot. The Q&A sessions with residents and local police were in full swing, and while the discussions were seldom easy, they were happening. People who would never have shared a conversation began tentatively opening up. Instances of community collaboration, such as neighborhood watch programs that included residents from all backgrounds, popped up. Bradley, once seen as a symbol of oppression, began to approach community policing with empathy, a shift that won him cautious respect from those who once feared him. For Daryl, every step felt surreal. Could saving a single life really spark these shifts? It wasn't that everything was perfect now. Racial slurs still festered in corners of the internet, and some folk remained guarded. But hope was blossoming in a town that once felt stuck. One morning, an official letter arrived from the governor's office, inviting Daryl to join a statewide task force aimed at exploring best practices for police reform and community building programs. He read and reread the letter, scarcely believing it was meant for him, a simple mechanic with a complicated past. But the invitation was real, and it both honored and daunted him. After deliberating with Arya, after quietly remembering his sleepless nights and the moment that changed him, Daryl accepted. At the next local meeting, this time held in the parish hall, with an even bigger turnout, Daryl spoke more confidently, announcing his role in the upcoming task force. He encouraged the community to stay engaged. He even credited Officer Bradley's willingness to grow, praising how they'd all come a long way since that fiery night. Applause shook the hall. Outside, a local journalist caught Daryl's arm to say, "Never thought I'd see this place come together like it has. Don't stop now." The months that followed brought a sense of purpose Daryl never anticipated. He traveled across the state for task force sessions, sitting in deliberations with veteran policymakers and law enforcement heads. Standing at the heart of each debate, Daryl consistently reminded everyone, it's about saving lives, not about politics. We do that by building trust. Over and over, he returned to that pivotal image, a civilian's hands pulling a sworn officer out of certain death. In that raw moment, the differences that ordinarily defined them no longer mattered. Each trip returned him home with new ideas, training programs that included mental health support for officers, open forums in schools, specialized recruitment strategies to diversify police departments. He shared these ideas with local leaders. Progress unfolded, sometimes haltingly, sometimes faster than expected. The town quietly became a case study in bridging divides, with its local newspaper running stories titled "From Torched Car to Torchbearer: How One Act of Rescue Sparked Reform." Now recognized beyond county borders, Daryl balanced mechanical work and activism. The garage remained a peaceful retreat. He still relished the straightforwardness of fixing an engine or replacing a carburetor. Metal, after all, followed predictable rules. People didn't. Yet it was people he wanted most to help mend, one relationship at a time. Eventually, opportunity knocked in the form of a high-profile symposium in Washington, D.C. Focusing on police accountability, Vivian encouraged Daryl to take the stage. Though the thought of national visibility shook him, he recognized that his personal, authentic story might resonate in corners of power. With Arya's unwavering support and a surprising letter of encouragement from Bradley, Daryl accepted the invitation and prepared meticulously. On the day of the symposium, he stood in a gleaming auditorium, wearing a blazer and tie that felt slightly foreign, yet also a testament to how much he'd grown. As he recounted his journey from a traumatized ex-firefighter to a reluctant local hero, the room fell silent. National figures, with their polished reputations, listened keenly as Daryl's voice quivered with emotion. He spoke of the unwavering need to see each other's humanity. He recounted how saving one officer's life triggered conversations that had seemed impossible just a year before. He ended by urging the audience to consider that real change depends on everyday acts of compassion and the courage to confront our communal wounds. The ovation that followed was overwhelming, but the deeper reward lay in the discussions afterward. Policy experts, lawmakers, and civic leaders huddled around Daryl, asking pointed questions about what specifically made a difference in his hometown, what overcame cynicism, what overcame distrust. The answer he gave time and again was simple: people who decided to care about each other, even when it was easier not to. After that day, Daryl's phone buzzed with more calls, from documentary filmmakers, more civil rights organizations, and even a local publishing company that proposed a book about his experience. Each was a chance to extend his message, but also a weight that tested his energy. Toggling between public activism and his quiet mechanical life became a balancing act. Sometimes he worried he would lose himself in all these demands. He discovered grounding back in his own community. The Q&A sessions, now in their second year, had turned into structured monthly meetings. Officer Bradley, fully recovered, organized foot patrols that emphasized conversations with shop owners and families, offering a friendlier face to local policing. Meanwhile, a local youth mentoring program took shape. Daryl frequently volunteered, teaching basic car repair skills and weaving lessons about responsibility and resilience. Teenagers, curious about his brush with fame, looked to him less like a distant hero and more like a relatable figure who had once been scared and uncertain, just like them. One crisp autumn afternoon, Daryl found himself strolling down the main street with Arya. The sun painted the shop windows a golden hue. They remarked on how different the atmosphere felt, how the tension wasn't gone, but had softened. Hateful graffiti hadn't reappeared in months. Rumor had it that the department was re-evaluating all its training modules, focusing on de-escalation and community outreach. And while suspicion and prejudice didn't vanish overnight, enough seeds of progress had been planted that many believed they would flourish. "I never thought I'd see the day," Arya said, gesturing toward a small group of officers casually chatting with a group of high school kids in the donut shop. "All because you took a risk that night, Daryl." He exhaled slowly, reflecting on how that near-tragic accident had become a catalyst for his own healing and for collective reformation. "I guess life has a way of calling you back to the fire," he replied softly, "only to show that you still have something left to give." Looking across the street, he spotted Bradley exiting a bookstore, a small grin brightening the officer's otherwise stern face. Their eyes met, and they exchanged a wave. That simple gesture felt like the prologue of a better story, one neither of them had believed was possible a year before. Not everything had been resolved. Some critics still labeled Daryl a publicity hound, others dismissed the reforms as cosmetic. But the air had changed. People felt empowered to speak. Churches organized open discussions on race and policing. Businesses sponsored scholarships for youth from underrepresented backgrounds, some hoping to guide them into public service roles. Daryl faced a new sense of belonging in a town he once tried to blend into. He would occasionally stand in front of the garage, remembering the terror of that burning car and his own fight to remain invisible. Now, with a supportive community behind him, he no longer feared stepping out of the shadows. Eventually, the local government announced the creation of a permanent community relations council. Daryl was offered a seat, as was Bradley. They accepted, both aware of the complicated but necessary task ahead, ensuring that empathy and dialogue became fixtures rather than fleeting gestures. It would take consistent, purposeful effort, but it felt like progress worth fighting for. Looking back, Daryl realized that saving Bradley that night had been driven by instinct and vestigial courage from his firefighting days. Yet the far-reaching consequences revealed that heroism doesn't stop at a singular rescue. It can ripple outward, challenging old biases and bridging divides once believed insurmountable. No longer captive to memories of a deadly fire, Daryl embraced a new identity, an ordinary man who had done something extraordinary, then shouldered the responsibility that came with it. Each day, he still rose early to fix cars, still found peace in the rhythmic whir of an engine, and each evening he found purpose in forging a town and, eventually, a world that welcomed honest conversation, healing, and hope. Life can change in an instant, just as it did for Daryl. One act of courage shifted his destiny, transforming him from a reclusive mechanic into a beacon for reform and unity. In a society often riddled with mistrust and old grudges, his journey stands as a testament. We each hold the power to heal our communities, step by step, choice by choice. If this story resonated with you, please help it reach more people. Like this video, share it with friends and family, and subscribe to the channel. By doing so, you become part of this incredible circle of change, proving that even the smallest action can radiate hope. Thank you for watching, and thank you for believing in the potential of everyday heroes to bring us all closer together. Daryl's story might be fictional, but its message could spark real transformations in our world.